Okay. We'll stop sharing results and do you want to move to the third poll before we go on, Kai?
Yep, please go ahead.
The
No, that
third
makes sense.
poll is maturity. How mature or advanced is your organization in tackling supply chains? And we'll go to launch polling. How mature or advanced is your organization in tackling supply chain ethics? Firstly, no formal plans. Planned but not formally launched. Program being implemented. Program fully implemented. And we're getting the results. You really are quick on the buttons, you lot. You've done this before, so you're coming in quite well. And the numbers are going up. Getting more people coming in. So I think I'm going to give you 10 more seconds on this one because they're still rising. So 10, 8, 5, 4, 3, last chance, 1, 0, end polling and share results. And so there you see that in most cases there's a program being implemented, roughly equal for no formal plans and fully implemented, and quite a number planned but not formally launched. So what do the panel think of that status of maturity?
It's very much in line with what we see when speaking to clients. There's quite a diversity of stages that the companies are in. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The same expectation I would have had also.
And I think from my side, it's super encouraging because if you had asked that same question just 12, 18 months ago, the figures would have looked very, very different. You see already, there's a lot that is now in the process of being launched. I have to assume that's, an awakening that has happened in the last year or two. So this is really good. And I remember a conversation a year ago or so where the figures were really horrible. So great that we either are seeing a significant improvement, or we just happen to have some amazing people on this call.
I think you've got some amazing people, Thomas, because the numbers are creeping up. It's quite a high attendance rate, and also they're very enthusiastic pollers. So I'm going to back out now and monitor the chat. Please keep your questions coming in via the Q&A or the chat. I'll be there to monitor it, and I'll disappear from the screen now. See you later.
Thank you very much, Bill. So then let's get started with a presentation from Harald. I think you should be able to share your screen. And yeah, here we go.
Cool. You can see my screen? Okay.
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. Yeah, then I'm more than happy to kick off today's webinar with the educational side of things, hopefully laying the groundwork for an exciting subsequent discussion. The first topic I want to cover is answering some of the key questions around the Supply Chain Act, the Lieferkettengesetz, as it's called, Supply Chain Act in a nutshell. And I say we jump right in and take a look at the first question, which is, what's the status quo? Where do we actually stand with supply chain due diligence legislation around the world? And prepared a quick overview here, basically highlighting that what is coming out of Germany in terms of legislation is nothing new. There have been many regulations and laws already passed recently. First one in 2010, the conflict minerals provision, quite limited in scope, but still, Modern Slavery Act out of the UK. The first really broad scope supply chain due diligence legislation came out of France in 2017, the Loi de Vigilance, which is really the forebearer of what is now coming out of Germany, and many other European countries have followed suit. I'm not even showing all of them here. We have Luxembourg and so on. But the German law is in many ways ambitious, and it is also very close to being passed. The current state is that we can expect the law to be passed before the summer recess of the Bundestag, so let's say by the end of June. But also, maybe more importantly, the European Union is also acting. The European Parliament has submitted and also passed with a great majority a resolution that is now in the hands of the European Union Commission for a corporate due diligence directive. It is not yet passed, but it is being prepared by the Commission based on this proposal of the Parliament. The current expected timeline is that we will see a passed directive from the EU in 2022 on this topic, harmonizing the landscape across the member countries, which I think is reflecting the wishes and interests of the business community. That harmonization makes a lot of sense here. But seeing this landscape and how the regulations and laws have increased, I think it's also valuable to take a step back and ask ourselves, why now? What has really changed about the landscape that all of a sudden there's so much movement? And I want to share with you 3 trends that I believe are at the core of this. The first one, very obvious, but of course we have to mention it, is globalization, making supply chains more complex and also more intransparent. But it's also the consumers themselves that are becoming more and more aware and conscious of the supply chains that lie beneath the products they are purchasing. And this is also reflected in a recent poll conducted in September by Infotest DIMAP that actually shows that 75% of German citizens support the Supply Chain Act. And I think, yeah, there's not a lot of political initiatives with such broad support these days, so that is quite important. And the third trend, and I think this also relates to why there's so much consciousness on the consumer side, is the smartphone revolution. And social media usage rates are above 50% almost everywhere in the world. And this means that the information gap between the third world and the first world is now closed. Incidents about violations around labor rights and human rights and environmental issues were previously much more hidden, but due to everybody having a smartphone in their pocket and being able to share things on Twitter and everywhere else, those things are suddenly visible and therefore also in the mind of consumers here in the developed world. Okay, now let's say dive into the Supply Chain Act in more detail and actually have a look at which companies are actually affected by the law and what's the scope of the law. Comparing the German Lieferkettengesetz against the 2017 French Loi de Vigilance and the upcoming and current proposal of the European Union. First of all, in terms of scope, they are starting with 2024, companies headquartered in Germany with more than 1,000 employees are in scope. These are on the whole close to 3,000 German companies that are covered by the law. These are a lot more than what we saw out of France, where the law applied only to 100 to 150 French companies. The European proposal is much more ambitious in that it not only applies to companies registered in the European Union, but also companies active in the internal market, similar to the way GDPR also applies to United States-based companies doing business in the EU. This law is also in its current proposal applied to companies active in the EU, and it applies to the European Union definition of large enterprises. So these are companies with more than 250 employees or more than 50 million euros in annual revenue. So we can see that these are a rough calculation, more than 20,000 companies would be covered. So yeah, a quite significant step, also even beyond the German proposal right now. The German law will come into effect on the 1st of January 2023. Its scope in terms of which rights are covered is primarily around human rights and environmental provisions. The EU proposal also goes one step further by also covering governance risk explicitly, so corruption and those types of risks. And last point on the reach, which tiers of the supply chain are covered. The German law has full coverage for the first tier of suppliers, reduced coverage for the second and further tiers. I will also get to that in a subsequent slide. Again, the EU proposal much more ambitious in that it covers the value chain. So the full supply chain, but also the customer side. So this is also a bit of a shift as opposed to previous regulation. But of course, we have to see what is eventually passed at the end of the day by the European Parliament. Next question that we want to look at is, what does the law actually require of the companies that are covered by it? The first thing it requires is human rights due diligence on the following issues. These are occupational health and safety at suppliers, labor rights and standards, so freedom of association of workers, collective bargaining rights, but also fair working conditions with safety and breaks and so on. Modern slavery and child labor, and also environmental protection, particularly as it relates to human health. In many ways, the law is centered around human rights. Therefore, also the environmental protection is as it relates to human health. And now, I think to the part everybody has probably been waiting for is now what's actually required by the law of companies on a, let's say, process perspective. Which measures do companies need to take? And we prepared this and split those requirements up into two groups. First of all, a group of requirements that are of relatively low complexity or that are already required in other regulations to some degree or another. These are, first of all, companies are required to issue a policy statement, and they need to assign organizational responsibilities. So clear reports to management, similar to the way GDPR requires data protection officers to be assigned within companies. Secondly, the law requires companies to implement a grievance mechanism. So a way of receiving grievance reports from the public. In its simplest form, this is an email inbox published on the website where you can receive grievance reports. And thirdly, the law also requires additional provisions and standards for sustainability reporting. Companies of a certain size are already required to prepare sustainability reports as part of their annual reports. And the law requires to also extend this around certain topics around supply chain due diligence. But now let's have a look at the two requirements that are really new and also significantly more complex. First of all, this is a requirement that companies now implement a mandatory and continual risk analysis for their first tier suppliers. So these are measures to identify any risks or issues, disadvantageous human rights impacts in the first tier of their supply chain. And out of this, the second more complex requirement is that for any issues that are made aware, the company is made aware of through either the grievance channel, so for any grievances that are reported, but also through risks that are made aware through the risk analysis part, companies need to implement measures to mitigate and to process those risks. They need to document that they are dealing and processing those risks. And they also need to implement measures to prevent any such occurrences in the future as is possible. So this is really, if we can sum it up, requirement number 4 is you need to look, you need to identify risks, and requirement number 5 is you need to mitigate and process risks as they occur and as you are made aware of them. So these are the top requirements there. And now let's have a look at how they are actually applied when it comes to the lower tiers of the supply chain, because the law is also quite explicit on that point. First of all, the law states that due diligence obligations apply to the entire supply chain, so from tier 1 to tier N or tier 2 plus. But the requirements are appropriate and tiered, meaning the more indirect the business relationship is, the lower the requirements are. So the further you get down the chain, the lower requirements are, and the less influence you have over those business partners, the lower the requirements are. And also, maybe even more importantly, the risk analysis part, that is here requirement number 4, is for the lower tiers of the supply chain only required on a case-by-case basis. So as you become aware of issues in your tier 2 and beyond, through grievance reports or through incidents that you become aware of, you need to deal with them just as if they were occurring in your first tier, but only on a case-by-case basis and not in a continual way as it is required for the first tier. So that is the way the tier N requirements are reduced in the law. And now, last but not least, for this first part of the educational piece, what are the penalties and how is the law enforced? The penalties are, on the one hand, possible exclusion from public procurement processes for up to 3 years, and also possibly fines to the order of up to 5 million euros in case no risk analysis is implemented and conducted, up to 8 million euros in case no grievance mechanism is put into place or there is no follow-ups on grievance reports that are submitted, and 2% of annual revenues, taking, I think, from GDPR, the way this is handled there, in case there are no mitigation measures and no case management measures taken for known violations that are covered under the law. So that is really the hierarchy of fines. And how is the law enforced? There are 2 ways for enforcement, either through a grievance report that is brought by actual victims of human rights violations. So there must be a victim associated with a complaint. And this complaint, this grievance report, can be brought either to German courts or to the responsible bureau, the BAFA, the Federal Office for Economic Affairs and Export Control. And this office is also explicitly tasked with monitoring implementation of the law at the subjected companies. So this bureau will check any grievance reports that are submitted to it, and they will also check documentation that is provided by the companies. Again, similar to the Data Protection Agency works with GDPR. And that is the last point I want to make on this section about the Supply Chain Act. And there are some practical ideas and considerations around enforcement. So if we, let's say, go a bit away from the theory into the practice and think, what does this actually mean practically, and what implications can we expect also from similar regulations like GDPR and also other regulations like the conflict minerals provision, the loi de vigilance, and also other initiatives that are not yet directly related to the Supply Chain Act, but I think they show a clear pattern, and that is that in all of those cases, NGOs and interest groups are targeting well-known B2C companies, well-known high-profile brands with hot topic cases. So with GDPR, we have Google targeted, by the NGO None of Your Business, led by Max Schrems and also a French NGO. The international rights advocates are targeting Apple, Tesla, and Dell and Microsoft in the US courts over cobalt, conflict minerals issues. Total, the oil and gas companies targeted as part of the loi de vigilance. So these, I think, is certainly patterns that we will see repeating and probably intensifying. And this means, and this is the last point I want to make, is that particularly those companies, those highly public brands, they will need to be extremely proactive with their risk management and with their communication around supply chain due diligence, because that will be the best strategy to really be proactive, transparent, and yeah, as transparent as they can possibly be. All right, that was the first section. And now, in the last, let's say, 2 to 3 minutes, I want to give you a quick overview of the solution landscape. So now knowing what the law requires, giving you a quick overview of what technologies, which solutions are out there that can help companies implement and yeah, be compliant with the law, especially in a scalable way. And therefore, we want to focus again on those top 2 requirements, as they are the most resource intensive to implement. Also, they are new, and therefore they lend themselves to technology support and automation, especially to grasp the complexity that is lying in supply chain risk management and supply chain due diligence. So breaking this down, what does the solution landscape look like? How can these 2 requirements be addressed with solutions that are already available on the market in different ways and shapes? So across those 2 requirements, we can identify really 3 key questions that need to be answered in the process of developing solutions. And that is, what is my supply chain? Leading into what is happening in my supply chain, so which issues are rising in my supply chain? And finally, how can I manage and mitigate those issues that are arising in my supply chain? And taking those questions step by step, the first question, of course, is the question of supply chain discovery. The first tier suppliers are known, and it is a strong recommendation to get started on due diligence implementations with them as soon as possible. But of course, there's also the need to discover the supply chain more deeply, particularly around critical raw materials, conflict minerals, leather, natural rubber, and so on. And there we have really 2 solution areas, which are supply chain mapping solutions. This is usage of public data, using artificial intelligence to scrape public data, scraping supplier, customer relationships, but also employing supplier engagement solutions. A notable startup is Sustainable, a German startup that is employing very smart solutions there to be able to map those supply chains. But also traceability, that's the second buzzword in that area of what is my supply chain. And that is gaining an understanding of critical raw material flows in the supply chain, especially around raw materials that are by their nature hard to trace, and meaning tracing them back to their origin, back to the mine where they came from. Cobalt, for instance, notorious, typically bought through trading relationships. How can you be sure that the cobalt you're getting is really coming from mines that are operated sustainably and with the right human rights procedures? So that's where traceability solutions, blockchain approaches. A notable startup I can name is Circular, a startup that is implementing blockchain technology around cobalt traceability and others. The second area is the question of what is happening in my supply chain. This is the area really of risk analysis and identifying risk at its core. And here the basis, and this is, I think, a very positive sign, almost all of the companies we see that are relevant for the Supply Chain Act have a supplier code of conduct in place, and many of them also already have assessments, supplier assessments in place to validate and check compliance with those supplier code of conducts. For those assessments, typical solutions would be EcoVadis, tools that help you in conducting assessments among your supplier base in efficient ways. But those assessments, by their very nature, are always periodical and static, meaning you have those assessments maybe once a year, you have them for new suppliers. But the question, of course, remains, what is happening at my suppliers on a day-to-day basis? Is there a labor strike happening? Are there repeated labor strikes happening at my suppliers? Are there repeated work accidents, reports around corruption, pollution? And that is the solution area of monitoring, which provides you with real-time and proactive insights around what risks are really happening in your supply chain. A critical input in being able to really implement a proactive risk management. And of course, the output of the second question are critical suppliers, critical risks happening in the supply chain, and those need to be managed and mitigated. And there we also have service providers, on-site audit providers, very crucial, many practiced by most manufacturing companies already. But we also have, and this is maybe the last one I want to focus, supplier engagement. And this is also a topic that I think will increase in the next years. How can I really engage my suppliers around due diligence issues? One way would be conducting workshops, trainings, really engaging with them on a person-to-person basis. But there's also, again, startups active in that space. A notable startup would be Ulula, a Canadian startup that has developed an app that you can deploy at your suppliers. And this app is a direct grievance channel for workers of that supplier to submit anonymous reports on their working conditions and how they are treated. So really a great tool to bring more transparency to potentially problematic suppliers. And now the last point before we lead into the discussion, and hopefully we can set up some of the points for the discussion here. And that is the case study of Prewave, the company where I'm a co-founder of, with the Volkswagen Group. The Volkswagen Group has been using Prewave for more than a year, using our artificial intelligence solution to bring more transparency to their supply chains and minimize sustainability risks. And let me show you how we are doing that together with Volkswagen. This case study has been published in a press release recently, and you can also see it on our website. But then we, of course, quickly go into that. The first step we do is, again, sticking to the formula I showed you on the previous slide. What is my supply chain? And that is supply chain mapping. And the supply chain mapping at Volkswagen is focused around critical raw materials that have been identified in combination with the industry group Drive Sustainability. They have identified key raw materials that should be in focus for the automotive industry. And in addition, that supply chain mapping is added with supplier uploads, but also industry partners. We are partnering, for instance, with the Responsible Mica initiative on mapping raw material supply chains in a structured way. Those suppliers, as they are discovered, are then used as inputs for supply chain monitoring. This is where this artificial intelligence comes in, using artificial intelligence analysis of social media, but also news media data in 50 languages in order to provide real-time insight into ESG risks affecting the various aspects of the supply chain, from the mining level all the way to the tier 1 supplier. And the key part here is to prioritize those risks. And this is also a point we've spent a lot of time developing together with Volkswagen, how to prioritize those risks in order to allow for an efficient case management. So managing those risks as they occur, but in a prioritized way, so that you can do it with a small team in a resource-effective manner. So that is the Volkswagen case in a nutshell. Happy to answer any questions down the line. The last thing I want to say is that Volkswagen, but also others, they are really following the mindset of turning supply chain due diligence from a liability into an asset. And this is, I think, the mindset that we need to adopt and the way to go. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion and yeah, handing it over to you, Kai. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much, Harald. I mean, it's really a lot of information, and we know that actually, so if the Supply Chain Act passes the Bundestag or Bundesrat and will be enacted into, you know, for being active in 2023, it's still a couple of years, but time flies and there's a lot of stuff to do. So I think we all have to take actions now. Bill, do we have any questions from the audience, particular to this presentation from Harald?
Hi, Kai. There's two questions have come up. They're both related to. I'm going to run them together, although they're not quite the same. Both related to how this can be implemented corporately. I don't mean through the systems that Harald has so clearly outlined. One is, can Germany do this under EU law? And secondly, there is a thing called legal separateness between a corporate headquarters and its subsidiaries. They're supposed to be legally independent. How can it implement something through, how can it tell a subsidiary to do something if it's supposed to have legal separateness? Now, I think I'd be quite interested to put this one, if I may, Kai, to Thomas and Angela to ask if they think that this law may face some legal challenges on either of those bases.
Maybe I can start. So you know, I'm not the lawyer in the room here, and I assume that the German Bundestag have their T's crossed and the I's dotted before they go ahead. And so my assumption is definitely yes, this is of course going to happen. There is certainly a bigger one coming up with the EU. That's also my working assumption. And of course, we are imagining that this one gets enacted, and with that, we are also steering for the EU. And let's say the German part is a smaller part of that game altogether. And there is probably also a legal point around, can you, with the legal entity infrastructure, enforce other fully owned subsidiaries? Again, I think that's a very sort of defensive look at this, because most forward-looking organizations, want to operate above and beyond the legal requirements anyhow. And that will typically be enacted in codes of conduct, in policies, in how you train your people, and what is it that you are announcing and reporting externally anyhow. So I don't worry so much about whether that is a problem, because my plan is certainly to be above this level anyhow. So that would be my response here.
My view to that is also similar to what Thomas says. Basically, we are managed not by procurement, not managed by legal entities, right? We have global categories where we take typical actions based on the global categories view. That means it doesn't matter where the legal entity is sitting. It doesn't matter where the suppliers will be located, right? So we are doing that a very coordinated global approach. Therefore, I see it's less a problem to say, oh, there's a headquarter, then the subsidiary is somewhere else. It's one company, therefore we have only one act.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your answers. Bill, any more questions?
There's one for Harald. It's about how you get data for the tracking tool. What is being monitored? Does it cover social media as well as NGO activities?
Yes, yeah, it covers all the publicly available information on the internet, both social media, news media, and what's published on corporate websites, NGO websites. Yeah. The goal is to capture what is out there. The goal is to capture what you should know. Yeah, that's the goal. Yeah.
Super. Back to you, Kai.
Thank you. All right, so probably let's start now with a couple of questions which I believe could be of interest also, for the audience. So now we have learned actually that the Supply Chain Act focus mainly to avoid and prevent the violation of human rights, so probably kinds of ethical standards. And Angela, my question to you would be, why are ethical standards and sustainability personally is important to you?
Well, ethics standards, they are a set of principles and moral values, right? It's the foundation how we operate and how our company is interacting with our partners. As business leaders, we're making decisions every day. Every decision we make has an ethical dimension because they affect many of our stakeholders along the value chain. Therefore, for me, ethical standards sustainability provides a framework for me to make decisions. On top of those, very objective, analysis, data, information, very factual-driven decisions. So I think it is adds-on. It's one of the dimensions we have to consider while making decisions. And also, ethics standards set the guardrails and prevent us from very, unlawful activities or taking a shortcuts on the costs of a long-term damages of a personal or a company reputation. Therefore, it's very, very important.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this really sounds like a solid base of principles here. Thomas, how about you when it comes to ethical standards and sustainability personally?
Well, I think first of all, I believe in the consensus of the scientific community, which is saying that we are living beyond the planetary boundaries. So, climate change is real, loss of biodiversity is real, and with that, if we accept that we have one planet, and our biggest responsibility is really to make sure that we prepare that planet for the next generations. If we accept that responsibility, the action follows very, very quickly after that. And I think also, as you mentioned, I have in my life had the benefit of also seeing a lot of this firsthand, lived in Africa and Asia and in the rainforest, and I've seen what good practices are possible of how you can bring economic prosperity to communities who are not living as privileged as we are here in Germany. But I've also seen, what happens if you do things wrong. So it's through those first-hand experiences that I'm very, very keen to make sure that we then, as decision makers, as in a way guardians of sustainable supply chains in procurement, that we use this amazing power that we have. And in that way, that's informed what I do in Bayer, and it of course has also help inform what we are trying to do in the sustainable procurement pledge. It's one and the same.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Thomas. So Harald, you founded Prewave obviously for good reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, personally, I'm a young father. I want that my grandchildren inherit an intact planet. I mean, that's I think a motivation that we most of all share. But at Prewave, more specifically, we believe in using technology to our advantage to close information gaps that are there. The reason why many issues are not solved is not because there's not the need or the motivation to solve them, but oftentimes you lack the tools or the information to actually solve them. And that is sort of from the very founding, and Prewave was founded by Lisa Smith at the University Technology Vienna, already with the idea, how can we make things that are known locally in Indonesia? Maybe citizens complaining about a factory polluting the wastewater. How can we make that known in the procurement and purchasing departments of European-based companies? So closing that gap. And then you can solve problems if you know it, but oftentimes you just don't know it. That's what we are.
No, thank you. So indeed, technology is an enabler, obviously. So thanks for sharing. So I'm happy to hear that this coming from, let's say, industry leaders. So this should be really a role model, or something everybody should do. So happy that we have kind of role models here on the panel. So Thomas, before Germany criminalized the human rights violation, they relied on the voluntariness to respect social and ecological standards. So why do you think did this voluntary approach to supply chain compliance didn't work out?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was sort of a systematic bad intentions. I think there's, like Harald is saying, there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of sort of dogmas where people have made assumptions around this is good enough, and as time progresses, those standards also change. I think, of course, the system that we often live in a, let's say, financial-only capitalist system, where maybe the externalities are not fully integrated into your cost modeling, that may drive a certain tendency towards short-termism. And at times it can be pretty lonely to come with a long-term perspective that will not necessarily meet all your shareholders who may have slightly different expectations. And then, of course, it's also leadership. It's also fair to say that in certain organizations, the leadership's priorities, their compensation, is not necessarily directly linked with your performance on the broader sustainability agenda, which is something that Bayer has changed, right? Our bonuses are depending on whether we are delivering on our sustainable performance or not. And it's really a universal thing. It's not a German-specific issue. We see it everywhere. So misinformation, maybe lack of leadership with the right integrity, but I see things moving. So that's moving on.
No, I like that you're saying actually that is not really because of bad intention. It's probably really of lack of information, and that also tries probably motivation to probably be more active on this. So Harald, what's your view here?
First of all, and I think we get back to this point again and again, the problem is simply extremely difficult. Yeah? So the challenge to be placed on companies saying you must have a 100% clean supply chain is extraordinarily difficult problem. That's the first point I want to make. I think in terms of the voluntary approach, having worked or not worked, we should also differentiate a little bit on that part, because many, particularly B2C consumer-oriented companies, have been moving quite strongly already and for the past years. A few examples: H&M, Nike, Nestle. In many aspects, they have published their supply chains online. And they are moving, of course, in many ways also for marketing, reputational reasons, but still they are moving. And I think where there has been a little bit of friction and maybe less motivation is in the lower parts of the supply chain. Yeah, the tier 2s, the tier 3s. So just as the H&Ms and the Volkswagens have been feeling the pressure from their consumers, those suppliers have been feeling the pressure top down. But maybe the self-motivation was potentially a little bit lacking. Yeah? And I think this is maybe the most encouraging part we are seeing, and because at Prewave we are working with many tier 1s, tier 2s, also a shift in mindset there. Yeah? So also the shift that there is really no way around this anymore. Yeah? Transparency is happening, the movement is happening, and it's actually the right way now to go in front and be the leader on that train that is moving quite fast already. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So let's make sure that this train is not stopping here. Yeah. So if we now switch from the personal view to more the business context or business sides of things, Thomas, again, in the pharma industry, so what aspects of the ethical compliance is most relevant to your industry or to your organization?
Well, again, I guess general governance and making sure that you avoid, corruption, that you have those checks and balances. I think that's almost a business imperative. It's a non-negotiable if you don't do that. But naturally, in our industry, we have thousands, tens of thousands of local farmers that we are working with, who are helping us produce our seeds globally as well. And of course, in certain geographies, India, for example, there is of course a inherent risk that we end up with unwanted child labor. And that's been a topic that we have addressed since 2005, where we really have community engagement programs where we collaborate with the regulators, with local NGOs, to make sure that also those families make sure that their kids are going to school rather than finding themselves in the field. So that's one area. You are in the whole API production. Of course, there has been a series of challenges with spillages, also that may have consequences in terms of hormonal topics. That is something that we are obviously looking at very carefully as well. Okay. So I would say it's for each part of our business there is a unique set of challenges. As you can imagine, clinical trials, if you are also getting in new drugs, going through those different phases, making sure that the patient recruitment, that the treatment is done in the right way. So we have, our list is long, so that's why when the first question, how do you prioritize? It's not easy. We have to do them all. That's the fact.
Okay. So how this compares to the automotive industry, Harald? I mean, you probably have some insights for us.
Yeah. I mean, the automotive industry in general is in focus because it is producing probably the most complex product at large scale in the economy. Yeah, I mean, the car is the most. It's basically the smartphone is part of the dashboard, and then you have everything else around it. Yeah. And the car industry is really pulled in kind of two opposite directions. Yeah. On the one hand, it's electrification. Yeah. We want to move away from the traditional gas engines, but we also want 100% clean supply chains, because the consumers that are pushing for the electrification are also the most sustainably minded consumers. And this is difficult because the car industry is kind of shifting its supply chains towards what is needed for electrification, which are battery packs, which means all of a sudden you have a huge demand and demand for rare earths, cobalt, zinc, nickel, in quantities that are immense. And that, of course, is, I think, to answer your question, what should be the focus? That is one of the main focus areas, because it brings together sustainability for the consumer with that supply chain orientation and sustainability more broadly. How can we actually make this work over the next 100 years on a raw material side of things?
No, that absolutely makes sense. I think you will see this in more or less all the industries. So I personally work in the flexible packaging industry, and everybody's talking about plastic packaging. So actually here we also need to look really how we can offer solutions. So before the Pre-Supply Chain Act or Lieferkettengesetz, there is already a compliance life or system actually assisting with, let's say, somehow similar topics. So Angela, what was your company's approach to supply chain ethics before this law?
Yeah, in our group, our activities are based on the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact, and also the 4 basic principles of the International Law Organization, the International Labour Organization. We have implemented a few major activities, like we have run annual risk analysis based on our commodities on the group level, as I mentioned. We have integrated also CSR wording as a contract essential part of our onboarding procedures of all suppliers. We have been part of the EcoVadis assessment. 2019, we were achieving the silver status. Right now, we're doing the reassessment. We have also supply code of conduct in different languages in place already. We have also established complaint systems it's a channel where our suppliers can report any kind of violation of human rights whatsoever. And this system allows also the full anonyms, and it's anonyms, and also it's via an ombudsman. So there's a procedures well established. We of course also provide all CSR sustainability trainings to our procurement community, but as well as to big, let's say, stakeholders. For aviation industry, as you know, those materials or service and parts which we buy has something to do with sustainability in terms of CO2 emission. We are working with our OEMs to look at where can we save fuel or use alternative fuel, for instance. We are working on different initiatives like recycle, or we call it upcycling of used aircrafts to reuse many of the parts. We are looking at also plastic free on board, for instance. There are initiatives also from our crew to look at what can we utilize, things which we can, taking out of the, uniforms, for instance. So there's a lot of initiatives actually going on.
Okay. Yeah, that's really extensive, I would say. So Thomas, is there anything to add? We can't hear you. You need to.
No, yeah. Sorry. Classic. I was on mute. I think actually what Angela described is the sort of best case scenario of how do you have an inclusive system, etc. Maybe the only thing I want to add is that we as Bayer have not really wanted to do all of this in isolation. So already 10 years ago, in 2011, we were part of the founding members of Together for Sustainability, as well as the Farmer Supply Chain Initiative, where it's really about solving these challenges in our supply chain together. So all of the things that Angela did, and if we can do it in an industry collaborative setting that is compliant from an antitrust perspective, you can actually have a much bigger impact much faster. So for example, TFS, we started with 6 companies. We have 31 companies now in the chemical industry. Sales of 350 billion. I mean, it's big. 10,000 EcoVadis assessments that are active, on and on and on. So my recommendation is everything that Lufthansa is doing, but find partners and then find ways of collaborating in the industry or even across industry. That's the right way forward.
Okay. Thank you. Compliance and ethical standards, those are big topics actually. And if you really want to implement things like this in your company, this is something has to do also with the culture change of your company culture. So Angela, can you describe how this process went at Lufthansa on board level or senior management level?
This is a very important topic, right? Sustainability, CSR is a part of the board agenda. Therefore, from the very top to down, we have established governance around this topic. Same time, we have also installed dedicated teams and working groups working on different initiatives, like I mentioned previously. So it's also we need the buy-in from our employees as we're constantly communicating. But I'm very happy that actually when we explain why we have to do this, especially when we talk about responsible sourcing or integrated supply chain sustainability as a decision matrix, it is always well welcomed. I think this is actually the awareness is actually there in the context of a large community. So therefore, it's just you have to take the projects one by one and do the right things in the right sequence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you. Thomas, anything to add here from Bayer?
Well, I think the purpose of Bayer is health for all, hunger for none. So I mean, we are in the middle of this challenge. How do we deal with an ever increasing, growing population? Keep everybody healthy. How do we make sure that they have enough to eat and that it's done in an affordable and sustainable way? So these topics are totally interrelated with the company and what we stand for. And exactly as Angela is saying, it's of course a source of inspiration for people that we understand that there is a direct correlation between our action here with what the company is trying to achieve. So I think it's reinforcing the culture, the purpose of the organization, and our CEO is the chief sustainability officer. Again, bonus schemes are interlinked with performance, so it's hardwired into our systems. And and very few people would, not feel good about that.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, I see not so many questions coming up. Bill, anything we can address to the panelists? Or
I'm just wondering if you, I think you may have been answering some questions or some things that have been coming up on the chat, and some of it is about sustaining sustainability. Is there a danger that the focus may go off this area for a while? Perhaps another crisis, financial crisis, for instance. How do you maintain top level interest and vigor in this area? Now, those seem to be several people have come in and said, how do you sustain this and maintain the level of interest, and it isn't just a passing trend?
For us at Lufthansa Group, we have redefined our vision. Actually, the Lufthansa Group is all about connecting people and connecting culture and connecting economic systems, right? So basically, our business is people business, and we want to provide the best services to our customers. So therefore, sustainability gonna be there forever. I don't think that's gonna be going away after 2 years. Or we see that it's a project has start point and then has an end point. So that's actually, as I said, this is on top of our board agenda. And same time, if I look at our teams, as I said, we are actually looking at taking that very seriously. We have established dedicated teams working on this special projects, even in the crisis moment. You may recall that since last 12, 14 months, aviation industry is mostly grounded. So even in this critical situations where we run short of cash and where we run, disruptive supply chains, this corporate responsibility, including sustainability, is always there. One example was when we had a liquidity issue early the crisis phases, where we were really suffering that we are near bankruptcy, but we ourselves near bankruptcy, and where when we ask for support, suppliers who are really, those are like the common suppliers, not necessarily only focused on aviation, because we know those suppliers can support us throughout the crisis. And there are other suppliers who are much weaker position than Lufthansa itself, who is much more, suffering from the liquidity issues. We typically open up our payment channels that we supported those small, mid-sized, private-owned companies to access to their cash or their payment right in time. So because we felt at this critical moment, we could not, leave those people or those companies, go into a terrible situation that they really ends into bankruptcy due to we are not paying those suppliers on time. So this is one piece. And also in the crisis moment, there's also a lot of noise on internally to say, hey, if there's any chance that we can, not stop paying suppliers, right? That's actually all the time when our procurement community has to stand in front of those noises, say, no, we cannot, because there's a legal binding agreement we have to follow, and there's also this ethical parts where we have to take decisions. So I think throughout the crisis to as of today, this ethical standards, moral compass, but also, of course, looking at the CSR topic as a whole is always on our agenda. I think this will continue for a very long time.
Thank you, Angela. So probably looking into the time, we already still have 20 minutes left. So probably we jump into one question which could be of interest, and this is addressed to Harald because he's probably the closest to the implementation of the recent, requirements which we have seen. So what are typical roadblocks you have observed, and how you dealt with this with the implementation, and secondly, what are relevant success factors and why in the implementation?
I think we have to differentiate. We are working with companies of different stages of maturity. We are working with companies that are, in a sense, starting out. I think if you take the case of Bayer, Lufthansa, we can see they are quite mature already and they have organizational structures set up. I think the challenges are really with those companies that are now really kicking off sort of their also organizational structures, processes, And those are the companies that, they need best practices, and they are, of course, on the other hand, most open to technology support, because they're at the stage of maturity where you can introduce the technology from the get-go. Difficult questions are, as a matter of fact, where to start. So the big open sea, where to start. The other recommendation is always start with the suppliers you know. There's oftentimes this sense of, if I do not know my entire supply chain into the deepest areas, I cannot start. This is wrong. Start with what you know. Discovery of supply chain is a work stream that comes along. And the second important point is organizational setup. So how do you set yourself up organizationally? And there it is certainly a best practice that we see to have dedicated resources, dedicated people, a dedicated team focused on supply chain due diligence. If it's just a side job of a procurement officer, it's always difficult, because that's then the thing that gets dealt with at the end of the workday, and sometimes not at all. So setting up organizational systems, processes, and use technology to your advantage, because that is, I think, also maybe the last point. Using artificial intelligence in various steps of those processes, that can actually help you keep the team sizes small. And I think a roundabout figure is one full-time equivalent per 5 to 10,000 suppliers. That is what you should need around the supply chain due diligence. So we're not talking about hundreds of people. We're talking about maybe 3, 5, tens of people if you're a large organization. So that's I think the most important points.
Okay, no, thank you very much. So basically, with existing compliance structures, we already somehow manage our tier 1 suppliers. So probably look into tier 2 suppliers, let's say the suppliers of our suppliers. So Thomas, how do you control this? Do you have any formal process in place to monitor this or escalate concerns?
Yeah. So first of all, the complexity is enormous. So 60,000 tier 1 suppliers, and then you do some quick math, and then you are into the hundreds of the millions very quickly once you go to tier 2 and tier 3. So obviously we can't boil the ocean. So we do a segmentation approach. We look at what is critical for us to now have the transparency into tier 2 and tier 3. For us, the criteria is what's the critical medicine. So, is there medicine where people will die if they don't get it? If this supply chain breaks down, bad things will happen. For all those critical products, we have determined the full supply chain. And we're also using technology. We are partnering with the DHL 360 Resilience, which gives us then also the real-time information around this one here. And then, of course, we also look at the business impact. So, the brands, the products that has a big commercial impact, we have gone through the enormous effort of detailing tier 2 and tier 3. And the reason that I just want to go back to one of the comments that Angela had, that this is not going to go away. If anything, this will be even further accelerated in the years to come. We saw during COVID that there is a direct correlation between sustainable supply chains and resilient supply chains. So the fact that we have invested 10 years plus into these relationships, making sure we work with the right companies who have the same principles and operating strengths that we expect. That also meant that through the whole COVID experience, knock on wood, so far, none of our factories have been broken down as waiting for materials because of material disruption. So that is well understood across our supply chains, and of course nobody is interested in going back to those more in resilient supply chains that would happen if we take the finger off the pulse.
It sounds complex. So I just saw a question coming in. Bill?
Sorry, I'm on mute.
Sorry. Yeah.
There's a question about what happens when companies tend to focus closer to home and possibly shorten their supply chains in order to comply with all of these requirements. And the losers could well be the workers in poorer countries and more distant countries. There could be a law of unintended consequences happening here, where you give business to the richer countries in the areas where it's most easy to comply.
That's a good one.
I thought so.
Maybe one word from my side. The reshoring, that's always easier said than done, yeah, because there are many good reasons for those supply chains having gone global. Yeah? Of course, many raw materials, they are where they are. Yeah? I mean, that's the first step. But even, let's say, in the automotive industry, electronics industry, there are really know-how clusters developed in South China, for instance. They will not be reshored easily. Yeah? There is a semiconductor cluster in Taiwan. You will not reshore this easily. Yeah? So we really have to differentiate around those issues. I do expect, of course, and this is maybe also taking us into this competitive question. Yeah? What does this mean for the competitiveness? Yeah? Of course, in a sense, this is bringing German standards, European standards into the third world. And that is a little bit of a revolution. Yeah? And then we have to see what this means and how also what this means for competitiveness relative between companies and countries. Yeah?
No, that actually is a good point when it comes to competitiveness, because probably the Supply Chain Act will also have an impact on your supplier portfolio, on the supplier landscape. You're probably adding up organizational costs. So my question to Angela would be, with this respect, what impact would probably be the law have on the competitiveness of Germany in this case? We can't hear you now again.
So can you hear me now?
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay,
cool.
Good.
Thank you.
My personal impression is, first of all, I think the supply chain diversity is a diversified supply chain will have make the supply chain much more robust, right? You need for every material or services, multiple source of services. For our group, is by nature we have operations worldwide, so it's not possible to have all suppliers backsource them to Germany, right? It's just impossible. And second, I have to mention that if you have, let's say, qualification process in place where you integrate CSR, sustainability, whatever footprints, you can put that into evaluation criteria. When you source locally in any countries, you apply the same standards, right? And my personal experience is like whenever you go to a country where, let's say, a standard is typically low, you could invest. You can support the suppliers in many ways by providing training, by providing knowledge. Today with the webcasts or training platforms to help the suppliers get qualified. Once it's about, of course, the supplier do self-questionnaire answers to validate where they are. Second time, they also have to see that we really take that serious, right? If you don't demonstrate you take that serious, you don't come back. Once you audit them, you see you want to launch improvement measures, that you have to come back and really do audit, unannounced audit, for instance, right? That's demonstrate how serious you are. And I recall some years back when I was qualifying suppliers in East Asia, I usually go there without announcing them. And if they tell me, I'm doing a quite nice, wastewater treatment, I want to go there and see where this treatment take place, right? I really want to see where the wastewater goes into the river, in the next villages, right? So I think it's really a little bit about take that measures serious and also demonstrate you are really checking on them. And I think suppliers learn that very quickly.
Yeah. I think this is a good point. It's not about punishing your suppliers, it's about educating them, help them to grow and develop. So I think that's really, really reasonable. All right, thank you very much.
I would just like to maybe add one comment
Sure.
around the topic of global supply chains localization, because I do think that with many companies having signed up for initiatives like the Science-Based Target Initiative, there are some serious audacious goals around reducing your CO2 footprint. Of course, that will have an impact on global supply chains, but I totally agree with Angela that it's not going to completely reform a lot of those supply chains. I think when they do, it's probably linked with aspects of circularity, where you get into more local contained supply chains that have recycled content, and that will also be favorable towards your tally around CO2. And I do think we should not forget that, again, the whole topic is, of course, we're looking at a bit defensive. This is complicated, and we have to do all this reporting, and it carries this risk. But sustainability also has an enormous opportunity, in terms of business growth, in terms of doing things differently, in positioning your products to your clients. So I think that's one of the big opportunities also for German or European economy, that it's not about we are losing competitiveness. We are in fact gaining an edge, because we are ahead, and we have a high propensity to actually understand and drive these topics forward with innovation in mind.
Thank you very much. I think it's always good to also have this positive perspective on things, and it's half glass full and empty, this kind of thing. So I'm happy to hear this. So basically, now we heard about compliance, we heard about requirements, we heard about structures, we got your personal view at the beginning of the webinar. So what's your final advice to get started, or which message would you like to leave with your audience this evening? And Angela, I would like to start with you.
Yeah, Mark Twain said once, the secret of getting ahead is really getting started. Every day we as business leaders, especially in procurement, you are facing decisions, right? You have to make choice A versus B, right? So I think those smaller decisions, even the small steps, if you take every step the right step, then this will sum up into something really big and important, for the future. I think you just need to get started.
Thank you. Thomas.
I love that, and that would have been mine as well. The topic is enormous, right? And if you look at it, it's easy to freak out and be paralyzed. Don't do that. Get started, learn, fall on your nose, get up, and don't think you are on your own. I mean, I talked about the industry initiatives. There are many, many companies who are super happy to collaborate, and it's also great fun actually to find ways of collaborating, but also at the individual level, and that's a bit where the pledge, of course, has a role. So do reach out. There are many other ambassadors who are super happy to share their knowledge, take the opportunity, and it's your responsibility, and it's not going to go away. So get in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's not a weakness to ask also for help. So I think that's also very important. Yeah, thank you very much. So probably my final word is kind of ethical behavior is really a mindset thing, and it's a conscious decision. And it needs attention actually every single day, and it never ends. So thank you very much for the panelists for sharing their knowledge, their thoughts, their ideas, answering the questions of the audience. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Harald. It was really a pleasure to have you here on our first CIPS Germany webinar. So we are proud we made it. Yeah, we are preparing a couple of more webinars to come. And thank you, Bill, for helping with the question and answer piece. Well done, as always. So thank you so much. And yeah, it's time actually to close the webinar, more or less on time. Have a lovely evening, everybody, and hope to see you soon. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kai. Thanks, everybody.
Welcome.
It was a pleasure.
Ciao.